Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor and I'm a fellow at the Foundation. Today is November 3rd, 2025, and I'm glad to be here with Antony Loewenstein, author of the Palestine Laboratory and a filmmaker and independent journalist as well. Antony, you're in the future right now in Australia.
I'm in
It's
the future.
November
Australia
4th.
is kind of in the future, where I'm a whole different day. And it's also nearly summer here too. So it's a whole different perspective from where you guys are in the US. Yes.
That's
And we
bewildering.
haven't got Donald Trump as president. So there's also that. Yeah.
Antony, thank you so much for making time. Um,
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're going to be discussing a handful of topics. So first of all, we're going to be discussing your recent trip to Germany. I'm sorry, your recent film about your trips and
Mm.
visits to Germany. We're also going to talk about the Palestine Laboratory. And then finally, you and I co-edited a book over, I guess, maybe a dozen years now called After Zionism. And the idea was about one state versus two states. And here we are after genocide. And so I'd love to get your perspective on how your thinking has changed there, if at all. But just by way of introduction, could you describe how you, as a journalist in Australia, became so immersed in the world of Palestine, Israel?
I grew up in Australia. I was born in the mid 70s, and I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that if you're Jewish, and I don't think this has changed all that much, or certainly in my view, not enough. It's pretty common that Israel is part of the furniture. It wasn't the center part of my family's life, not at all. But the idea that Israel was something that we should support, Israel was I was often said this is our homeland. Not that there was ever a move for us to go there at all. This idea that, and I was told this constantly by my parents, by family, that because of what happened to us as Jews, most of my family were killed in the Holocaust. The ones who got out were spread all around the world, including Australia. And God forbid something happens, we could go to Israel. And for those of you watching who don't know, as a Jew, I could, and just to be clear, I'm not an Israeli citizen and I have no intention of becoming one. But as a Jew, if I go there tomorrow, if I'm deemed to be Jewish, so to speak, within a few months, I can become an Israeli citizen and have a passport. And I mean, not that I was ever interested and keen on doing that by any means, but a number of years ago, I made a very strong political statement with a number of other Jews saying this is an absurd racist abomination that someone like myself, who doesn't have any direct connection to Israel, could become a citizen, whereas Palestinians who have often far more connection cannot become citizens. I mean, often there's even difficulties, as you would know very well as a Palestinian American, to visit the country, for Christ's sake. Palestine, not even Israel, because of course you have to go via Israel to get into Palestine. So when I was growing up, I guess Israel was sort of something I thought about and talked about. I'd never been there. My first visit was 2005, which I'll get to in a minute. But as time went on, I just was disillusioned with what I heard in my own family, often at Friday night dinners, Shabbat dinners, just the racism that I heard against Arabs, against Palestinians. And this was often expressed by fellow Jews, many of whom who had not been to Palestine. But there was, I mean, I remember hearing all the time, Yasser Arafat was Hitler. This is obviously when Yasser Arafat was running, head of the Palestinian, well, head of the Palestinian people. I mean, one could argue about that for many different reasons, but he was this, some ways, the official, so to speak, leader of the Palestinians. And Palestinians were essentially the new Nazis. And it's interesting because fast forward to after 2003 in October, the Hamas attacks on Israel, it was pretty clear that the language has not changed.
Hmm.
We regularly hear the Palestinians are the new Nazis and Hamas are essentially akin to Hitler and the Nazi Party, which to me is an absurd, racist ridiculousness. Anyway, so bottom line, this just struck me as weird and not, and over years I got disillusioned, to be honest, and started writing about this issue in 2003 as a journalist when I started doing journalism professionally. And as I said, I had not been to the country at that point yet. I'd thought about it, read about it. My views evolved by reading more widely, reading dissident Jewish historians, reading Palestinians. And this, of course, is worth saying. This was generally before the internet had exploded. I mean, I'm old enough that I grew up before the internet. And that I think fundamentally does change, in fact, how we see a lot of issues, not just Palestine. So yeah, I guess you could say I was kind of mugged by reality over time. I mean, I was never someone who was about to go to Israel and join up to the IDF. Nothing like that. I was never going to be someone who was going to make Aliyah, the term that we use to move to Israel. It was nothing, anything like that. But there's something about the racism that really hit me growing up, the racism against Arabs, that just struck me as weird and wrong. And it was irrational and tribal and bizarre to me that a Jew in Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, relatively prosperous, relatively safe, would have this visceral hatred towards Palestinians. Let me finally say on this point that for the majority of Jews, including me, I have no recollection of meeting Palestinians when I was growing up. Zero. There was no interaction, there was no conversation, there was no meetings, there was nothing. I don't recall exactly when I first met a Palestinian, but I doubt it was before my early 20s, which in hindsight is shameful, but it
Mhm.
wasn't that unusual. And I think in many Jewish communities, that has not radically changed, which speaks
Oh,
volumes about how those people see each other, frankly.
right. And that sounds, I mean, your experience tracks everything that I've heard and learned from Jewish American friends
Yeah.
who've gone on a similar journey, people born in the 70s, 80s. So, can you explain more about what the Jewish community in Australia is like? I mean, is it a sizable community? Is it primarily
Yeah.
Zionist? Is it conservative?
So the Jewish community, the Australian population is about 27 million as a whole. The Jewish population is about 120,000, so tiny. The Muslim population is far, far bigger, of course. And the majority of Jews are in Sydney, Melbourne. Sydney's our biggest city, which is where I am now, but I grew up in Melbourne, which is the second biggest city. Sydney's got about 5 million people. Melbourne's got about 3 or 4. That's our biggest cities. And very, very Zionist. Melbourne has had for decades one of the highest percentages of Holocaust survivors in the world outside Israel. And obviously, many of those Holocaust survivors are now dying, of course, but that deeply informed the very conservative, so-called pro-Israel perspective that existed in the Jewish community and frankly still does. Australia as a country for decades, with a few exceptions, has been very inverted commas pro-Israel. It doesn't really matter who is the prime minister. We have a system akin, a Westminster system akin to the UK here, as unlike the US system. Although weirdly, we still have the king in England as our head of state. Don't get me started on that, but we hope that's going to disappear at some point. Bizarre, but he doesn't make decisions for us every day. But it is ridiculous to me that the king is our head of state. Anyway, putting that issue aside. So, um, it's a very conservative Jewish community in general, very Zionist, very powerful pro-Israel lobby. Australia has been, I mean, people need to see Australia as we are essentially a US client state. And that's relevant for lots of issues, whether it's the war in Vietnam, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not just about Palestine. Pretty much if America says, come help us launch a colonial war somewhere, Australia will be joining forces before the Americans have even finished the request. I mean, this sadly is our relationship. Australia has a weird identity without wishing to go too much detail. Obviously, we were born, or the indigenous population has been here for tens of thousands of years, but since white settlement came in 1788, Australia used to be a British colony, committed genocide against the Aboriginal population here, sadly was remarkably successful in that, though not entirely, thankfully. And now Australia is an American colony as opposed to a British one. And although we are as far away from America as you can really geographically be, Australia is deeply insecure about our position. Although we're close to Asia, we're really within Asia. When I say we, I mean, it's not a view I have, but a general mainstream view is that we need a protector from Big Daddy. And Big Daddy used to be Britain, and now Big Daddy's Washington, regardless of who's in the White House. Joe Biden, Trump, it doesn't overly matter, to be honest. And although Trump clearly, and you would know this living in the US, is leading America down a very authoritarian path, it's done little to change the Australian desire to be as close to America as possible, if not closer. And that's not just about Palestine, it's about lots of issues. And for many of us, that's a shameful and worrying position.
That's actually very helpful. I've never been to Australia. It's an important country.
It's also very beautiful. I mean, Australia, like every country, is complex. It's a beautiful place. Good to bring up a family, but yes, politically, and racially has a lot of issues, like I guess a lot of countries, but it's a colonial country,
Well,
right?
how,
So
how does Australia contend with that genocidal history? What is the popular relationship to what happened in the
yeah,
18th and 19th centuries?
I think to say mixed at best. There is, in some circles at least, an acceptance of what the British did. I mean, just for those who don't know very briefly, the British came in 1788, regarded as they often did in country after country, the black indigenous population with contempt. They tried to wipe them out through violence, through disease, through alcohol, through a range of other means. They killed an unbelievable amounts of people until 1967. Indigenous Australians could not vote, which I guess in some ways isn't that dissimilar to the US, frankly, with African
Or
Americans
Palestine, Israel? Yeah.
or Palestine and Israel, indeed. Um, in some circles within Australia, there is a acceptance, awareness that there needs to be a reckoning around this. There was in about less than 20 years ago, the Prime Minister of the day, Kevin Rudd, who is now the Australian ambassador to the US, based in Washington, trying to appease Donald Trump every single day, apparently, is he made an apology in our parliament, essentially saying, we are sorry about what we did. We are sorry for the crimes, for the dispossession, for the starvation, for the death. There was no compensation associated with that. Now, I'm not minimizing that. It was actually important, and many Indigenous Australians took that seriously. However, it didn't come with many policy changes. It was words, and words are not unimportant. They are important, but the rates of incarceration of Black Australians is way, way higher than for white Australians. The rates of deaths in custody in prison is way off the chart. There's a lot of racism. I'm not saying every Australian, of course, feels that way, but look, the dynamic is not massively dissimilar to Canada, to New Zealand, in fact, different, or the US, or let alone Israel. And I think there's a lot to explain why many of these countries I just mentioned are 110% backing Israel. I see a clear connection between that. Colonial countries that were proud of their own dispossession see almost an affinity, I think, with Israel. They don't explicitly say that, of course, but I think that's there subconsciously.
And so your family ended up in Australia through, as an outcome of a different genocide, German
Indeed.
genocide.
Yeah.
And that's another place where you can now go and access citizenship as somebody who's the grandson of survivors.
Yeah, let me briefly explain. So when my grandparents on both sides, one side was in Germany, one side was in Austria, when they were able to escape, although most of our family, as I said, was killed, they couldn't get out. When they realized the catastrophe that was unfolding, like sadly too many Jews, they realized too late and they couldn't get out and they were killed in often death camps or elsewhere in Nazi Europe. But the ones who got out on my father's side came to Australia in 1939. But when they left Germany, Germany did not recognize their citizenship and said they were non-citizens. I mean, it was bullshit. They were Germans. The war ends, and Germany, as one way to atone for that, says, really sorry about that genocide. As Jews, if you're alive, you can regain your citizenship, essentially. But for roughly half a century, most Jews around the world, including my family, said, up yours, Germany, which I understood. Why would they want to be citizens of a country that tried to kill them? It made sense, right? But in the last 25 years, a number of Jews have taken that offer up, I guess. I had to prove it was my grandfather on my father's side. He was the one who arrived in Australia in the late 30s. I could regain my citizenship, I guess. Not that I feel German now. I don't feel German, but I felt like it was a worthwhile thing to have. It was worthwhile to become almost like a historical circle closing. I thought it was the degree of justice. And I have, and I still do, although, mate, we'll discuss my new film in a minute. But on the one hand, Germany has done more than many other countries that have committed genocide to atone for that, both in a financial and philosophical sense. There are many, many caveats to that, which we'll get to.
Right.
But
Well, so
yes,
one genocide. Yeah.
well, exactly. But of
Right.
course, they've also committed their own genocide, let's say in Africa, in
Right.
today's Namibia. And they remain, I wouldn't say in denial, but far from keen to address that genocide, which happened before the Nazi genocide. In fact, set the parameters and the behavior for what the Germans did during the 30s and 40s, which was learnt in Africa about 30 years before.
So I went to Germany in August on a reporting trip for Jewish Currents, and that essay will be published maybe in the next few weeks. But part of the assessment was, why does Germany hate the Palestinians so much?
Indeed.
And my conclusion coming away was that Germany felt that, or German elites, right? I'm speaking Germany in a
Yes.
general sense, felt that
Mm.
they'd atoned for the Holocaust. They'd paid a bunch of people off. They'd paid
Yep.
reparations.
Yep.
They have stood by Israel, do or die, and they would just like to move on and be a normal country. And of course, the Palestinians and other refugees there prevent them from doing that.
Mm.
What was your experience in going to Germany? Why did you make the film? So Germany's Israel Obsession was released by Al Jazeera on September 11th of this year.
Yeah.
What was the idea? I mean, it was the meeting of lots of things, right? I mean, genocidal
Mm.
societies kind of converged
Yeah.
on Berlin for you. So why did you go?
Yes. I have been going to Germany for a number of years, but yes, we shot the film in May this year. And I guess the film really tries to do two things. One, I mean, as you people will watch it, the initial part of it is partly a personal story about who I am, why I'm German, how this happened, the way that Germany has tried to atone, reflect on its previous crimes against Jews. However, the vast bulk of the film shows the vast bulk of the German elites, media, politicians don't really, I would argue, like Jews that much. They like a fantasy idea of Jews. There aren't many Jews in Germany. Let's be clear. There are very few Jews in Germany because they tried to kill all of them, right? So there are some who've moved back. There are a number of Israelis, in fact, who have moved to Germany in the last 20 years, some of whom are trying to escape the insanity in Israel itself. Those numbers have gone down in the last years. But nonetheless, there is as you rightly say, Ahmed, there's a real after the 2015 so-called migrant crisis, where Angela Merkel, the then chancellor, welcomed about 1 million refugees, a bit over, many from Syria, Afghanistan, elsewhere. Something that I supported. I didn't support her for a range of reasons. And many Germans accepted that. There were some who didn't, but they mostly accepted that. However, and it's an important however, Germany massively mismanaged that in the end. When I say mismanaged, I don't mean the day-to-day living of refugees. I mean the way that German elites talked about it and welcomed people in the end. It brought and it has brought a lot of people's contempt for those who are not white Christian Germans. And that then is transferred to Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs, brown people, black people, whoever they may be, including those who've been in Germany for decades. And the film, I guess, tries to explain and unpack why Germany has become one of the most vociferously, rabidly blind supporters of Israel. For those who aren't aware, Germany is the second biggest provider of weapons to Israel after the US. That accelerated after October 7 and Israel's genocidal war. And yes, nearly 2.5 years or 2 years after October 7, yes, there are growing cracks in that consensus, sort of. There's two things going on here. If you look at the German public, and I'll get to them in a minute in a different way, many of them have not supported Germany sending weapons to Israel. They have not. But what you see, and the film tries to touch on this, is there is still, I think, within German mainstream society, real anger and contempt and fear and resentment towards Jews in general, certainly those who support Palestine, and Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs. It's almost like reminding them of their guilt.
Hmm.
Like that guilt complex is deep. And
Hmm.
to some extent, Germans should feel guilty about what they have done in the past. I'm not denying that, of course, as a Jew, but it's manifesting itself in supporting another genocide. And there is little to no reflection amongst many in the German media or political elites across the political divide. Even the much of the mainstream left in Germany is 110% behind Israel. And finally, what's that leading to is that the latest opinion polls, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland Party, the far right party, is the most popular opposition party, polling about 25%. And their views are, it's hard to generalize, but are generally very fascistic, believe in so-called remigration, kicking out huge amounts of migrants, Palestinians, Arabs, Iraqis, etc., and building what I would argue is a white ethno-state, which is why they love Israel, because
Mhm.
Israel is that model. And as someone says in our film, Israel has become like the washing machine for the far right. If you're a far right activist, far right politician, and you say, I love Israel, I love Jews, who's going to accuse you of anti-Semitism? Like, what do you mean? I love Israel. And they admire Israel because of Israel's ethno-nationalist racist agenda, which they want to create in their own country, Germany, Sweden, etc., not as a Jewish state, but a Christian state. So Germany has a real identity crisis on its hands. And it left me, I mean, I had this before we went to shoot the film, but it left me pretty despairing. I fear for where Germany is heading. I really do. I think it's heading towards a pretty dark future.
And how did you feel being there personally as somebody who, again, has this family history, um, who may be regarded as kind of a special visitor because you're Jewish,
Mm.
because there was this philo-Semitic veneer everywhere you go.
Yes.
But
Yes.
who also has this deeper awareness of the fact that, that is kind of a chintzy surface. That at depth,
Yeah.
Christian nationalism is what's animating this place.
Yes, indeed. Look, in a way, I mean, again, yes, I'm a German citizen. Yes, I have a German passport, but I don't feel like German identity or history is deep within me. It's not. My family came from there, but obviously they left decades ago. I felt there pretty angry, sad. I felt disillusioned. I felt that I never felt unsafe as a Jew. I didn't. But I did feel there's a side of me that realized often that many Germans don't like Jews very much. I mean, they don't like Muslims or Palestinians either. When I say Germans, I'm talking about white Christian Germans, those who are backing the AfD, those who are made up in the government, those who mostly populate the media. As you say, their view of Jews and it is why I think there's so much contempt for dissident Jews or anti-Zionist Jews who are, I mean, there's no doubt in the last 2 years since October 7, those who have suffered the most have been Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims. There's no question about that. We say that in the film. I'm not trying to compare the two because that would be untrue. But many, many Jews who are critical have also lost opportunities and jobs, and artists have had, exhibitions cancelled. And there's virtually, like, I mean, there were very few critical voices that we met there, whether they were Jewish or Muslim, who said, we see a long-term future here. They all said they want to leave. Now,
I
now,
had the same experience.
right?
Yeah, please continue. But
I
it
mean,
was
as to
pretty,
where they're going to go, they said, oh, well, no, we might go to Spain, or I don't know. I mean, they hadn't, maybe Spain, which at the moment is a bit more, it's better on this issue. That could change, of course, but in general, Spain's been, in terms of Europe, one of the better countries around the issue of Palestine. And as you and I have often talked about, so many of these questions, what starts, as I often say, what starts in Palestine doesn't end there. This is not just about Palestine. Palestine is a litmus test, and most people in Germany are failing, frankly. So look, I didn't feel, as I said, unsafe walking the streets, but let's be clear, I'm a Jewish man who generally doesn't feel unsafe being in most places. I mean, I've been in some places in the world as a journalist where I have been, not so much because I'm Jewish, it's because I'm a white guy, in some places that can feel a bit unsafe. But um, no, overall, the major dangers there are to Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians. And we have those voices in the film who say that we are treated here as second-class citizens. There is contempt for us. And almost like, and one final thing, I don't know if we have this exact line in the film, but there is almost resentment amongst the German elites that Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims don't show deference to Israel. It's almost like, why don't you love Israel like we do? I mean, I think what the German elites are loving about Israel, of course, is the deeply racist, discriminatory, inverted commas, rose-colored glasses Israel.
Mhm.
I don't think every German white Christian admires the mass killing of Palestinians. Some do, definitely. And but I think many of them have a fantasy view of Israel.
What I also learned from people who I met there, what I also learned is that the German language media doesn't carry a lot of detailed and accurate reporting about the extent of the violence being meted out in Palestine, Israel. This is
Yeah,
historically, but certainly through the genocide as well. And that to the extent that people were aware of what was happening, it was coming from social media or English
yeah,
language media. Um,
true. Yeah, we
that
found that
was
too. And we have, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, no, I think the CEO of Axel Springer, or whatever that position's title is, recently accepted an award from Isaac Herzog, and that was
Yep.
also shocking, or maybe not
As
shocking,
a
illuminating.
He's a good soldier for Israel.
That's right.
Exactly. Illuminating. And I think, I mean, Axel Springer, the media company, which of course owns many outlets in the US as well, there's I don't know the exact words, but if you work for that company, you basically, as a journalist, as an editor, as just an employee, you essentially need to accept, I'm pretty sure it's in the contract, that you believe that Israel should be a Jewish state and has the inverted commas right to exist. I mean, that's pretty unusual for a media company to require that. But the big newspaper in Germany called Bild is a sort of I guess the equivalent would be the New York Post in the US, sort of which obviously is owned by Rupert Murdoch in the US, but Bild is owned by Axel Springer, which is a far-right newspaper which spends its time pretty much day in, day out demonizing Arabs, Palestinians, and Jews who are against Israel, doxing them. I mean, really extreme behavior.
Mhm.
Um, and they almost have formed a Praetorian Guard around Israel. But the impact of that mad, blind, uncritical support for Israel is leading to the rise and surge of the far right, which one has to presume Axel Springer is very happy about. Certainly is what Elon Musk urged the German people to vote for the AfD. I'm sure some people remember during the German election earlier this year, he was helping, funding, talking to AfD leaders in the hope that the AfD would win. They did not. They increased their support and they may well win an election in years to come. Would not surprise me at all.
Right. So you mentioned that Palestine is a litmus test for different things, but it's also a laboratory. Um, your book, The Palestine Laboratory, I think has been so well received because it gets at a fundamental truth. And it was issued in May 2023. Can you describe just briefly, or take all the time you need, but just describe the basic idea around the
Yeah.
Palestine Laboratory?
I was living in Palestine between 2016 and 2020, and I've been visiting as a journalist since 2005 in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And then 2016 to 2020, I was living there. My partner was then working for Oxfam, the NGO in Gaza and elsewhere. And one thing I started noticing was that there was some coverage, some viewers may remember, about Pegasus. This was the spyware that gets put on people's phones. And there was some good reporting about that's made by an Israeli company, ended up on, I mean, the company said it was just to go after terrorists and criminals, but actually the reality was it was often being put on dissidents' phones in various countries around the world. And there was some good reporting about that, but it always or mostly missed the elephant in the room, which was this wasn't some rogue Israeli company. This was literally, yes, a private company, but doing the bidding of the state. It was being used by Netanyahu, who's been, as you know, prime minister for most of the last 15 years, as a diplomatic tool to, inverted commas, make friends. He was selling them to India, to Hungary, to Rwanda. Those countries then use them on their dissidents, and those countries would then sometimes, for example, change their votes at the UN. Like this was how Israel was using it. And I was frustrated with what I saw as the lack of reporting about this. It wasn't a rogue company. It was a very much a mainstream Israeli company. So I started going down the
Sorry,
path
to
of
be
investigation.
clear again, this is spyware that was being installed on people's phones in order to monitor their communications without their knowledge.
Indeed. Indeed. It used to be that you would get a random text message, you click on it, then you forget about it, it was installed. These days it's called zero click, where all the user would need, a country, police force, intelligence service, just needs your cell phone number and the phone can be monitored. And Pegasus is one of many tools that now exist. I mean, the last few years, NSO Group, the company behind it, has had some troubles legally and internationally, which I won't go into, but a lot of other companies are doing exactly the same thing. They'd have less controversy, so to speak, but essentially they allow a user without your knowledge to control everything on your cell phone, including encrypted apps. So you
Mhm.
might think that you have a secure Signal account, but if your phone is compromised, it's irrelevant. They can still see what you're sending and what you're receiving. So, and I
And this
felt
was a
that
tool of Israeli statecraft. It wasn't an
indeed.
accident. You were observing the fact that Israel was using, the government was using this software capability to open diplomatic doors.
And I was doing that, as I said, from democracies and dictatorships. So I started looking into the Israeli arms industry, and I'm not suggesting I was the only person who was covering that. That would not be true. But it was remarkable how few journalists were covering this issue. And I felt there was a gap in the media coverage. So, there are, as many viewers of this podcast will know, there are so many international journalists who are based in Jerusalem. And the vast, vast majority of them are have blinkers on. What do I mean by that? They are covering what happened yesterday, what happened today in Palestine or Israel. Not irrelevant. Sometimes there's obviously important events going on, but too rarely do they look for structural questions. Too rarely are they brave enough to question the broader agenda of what Israel is doing. Often, if you speak to them privately, it's very different to what they publish in their newspapers or websites. And I did not see much coverage of the Israeli arms industry. And just a bit of context for people just to understand. Now, the Israeli arms industry is the eighth biggest in the world. It's massive. In 2024, the latest figures we have, the Israeli arms industry made just under 15 billion US dollars. They're selling it to many European countries, Arab states, places in Asia, pretty much everywhere. I estimated in the book, I think I said 130 to 140 countries in the last decades. And this didn't suddenly obviously start on October 7. This has been going on for years. And the book, I guess, tried to detail where this history goes. And for many people, at least on the left, there's an awareness that the US post World War II has been involved in some of the worst repressive states in the world, backing, arming, training dictatorships. What is less known, and most people were unaware, and I tried to bring some of this reporting and research in the book, was Israel has often been with America every step of the way. So there was a coup in Chile in 1973. The US backed that, yes, but Israel was right there with them, funding, arming, training Pinochet's thugs. There was a genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s. The biggest trainers and backers of that regime were Israeli, not American. There was an apartheid regime in South Africa. America was clearly very supportive of that, but Israel was frankly more supportive. And in fact, as I say in the book, it was a defense relationship there, but also an ideological one. They basically admired each other's racism, essentially. Israel admired South Africa apartheid regime against blacks, and South Africans admired the Israelis' apartheid against Palestinians. And right at the end, Ahmed, in 1994, when that regime ended, when virtually every country, including the US, had finally said enough is enough, you have a choice, you either stay as an apartheid state or you transition to a more representative democracy. The only country that didn't was Israel. They were with South Africa right till the end, which doesn't surprise me, considering not just the deep racism within Israeli mainstream society, but the fact that they saw South Africa as an ally in
Mhm.
their worldview. So the book is partly about that. And then I guess I wanted to do a book that really revealed that I don't think everything Israel does within Palestine and globally is explained by the arms industry. It's not. However, a lot of it is. That
And so
So
what is
many
the relationship?
countries,
I mean,
yeah.
it's implied, but will you be explicit here? I mean, so Israel's developing weapons. Who cares? Is it the how it's
Is
developing weapons?
Israel is developing weapons and testing them on Palestinians.
There
They
you
have
go.
been doing that
That's
for
exactly
decades.
it. Yes.
Yes, yes, I hadn't said that. I mean, it's yes. Let me say it clearly. Israel for decades has been testing, trialing, weaponizing arms and surveillance tech on Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and increasingly, in fact, they're using them on Israeli Jews as well. But that's a unsurprising side note. But it's principally against Palestinians. And they then sell those tools as so-called battle tested to global markets. They go to arms fairs, they promote these tools in the modern era in the last 2 years. In fact, since the genocide began, these companies, Elbit, Raphael, and others, will literally have videos, some of which are on YouTube, showing Palestinian civilians being murdered by these weapons, quadcopters, killer drones, whatever it may be, and then selling that as a supposedly attractive weapon to whoever knows, Vietnam, Philippines, parts of Europe, the Arab states, many of which, by the way, and it's worth saying this, many, in fact, most Arab dictatorships have bought and continue to buy Israeli weapons and surveillance tech. UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, most of them.
Right. And so
And
my next question to you is why is so there's no assumption on my part of good behavior or
yeah,
on the Arabs are bad. I want to say that unequivocally. The UAE is helping perpetrate some atrocities in Sudan now that we don't really speak about on this podcast, but it's shocking to the core.
a
Um,
genocide. Let's be clear. I mean, what's happening in Sudan, in
it
parts of
is a
Sudan, I
genocide.
think,
It's absolutely a genocide, exactly, and it's
mm,
doing it in concert with the United States
indeed,
and its
and
domestic.
Israel.
So that I'm not aware of. So where does Israel come into this?
Just to be clear, when I let me explain what I mean by that. The UAE support for the rapid support forces in Sudan who are committing the vast bulk of the abuses, not for a second saying this, the government in Sudan is also deeply repressive and has done horrible things for sure in the last 2 years since there's been a civil war has occurred in Sudan in the last years. Obviously, for many, many decades, the country was run by US-backed dictatorship. There was part of the Arab Spring, so to speak, was an overthrow of that regime. I wouldn't say there was glorious democracy, but there at least was a flowering of something different for a few years. That has then completely collapsed in the last 2 years, and there's been a civil war between two horrible men who are fighting over control for land and resources. There's huge amounts of gold in Sudan. And a lot of the gold that is being shipped from Sudan to the Gulf states, especially UAE, is why the UAE, amongst other reasons, is so keen to have access to that territory. They are backing, funding, arming genocidal forces in the UAE. And although that's been known for a while, as you say, it hasn't got nearly enough attention. Now, how does Israel fit into this? Israel, as far as I'm aware, is not funding either of those sides. They may well be, but not as far as I'm aware. But the Israeli connection is that the so-called architecture of where the US and Israel and the UAE want the Middle East to go is partially led by the so-called UAE vision for that. The UAE is deeply involved in what is potentially going to happen in Gaza. The vision of elements in the UAE leadership, Jared Kushner, they've said this openly, is a Dubai style territory. Now, I'm sure people on this podcast are aware of this, but Dubai and Abu Dhabi may be shiny and pretty on the surface, but actually they are cities built by slaves, run by slaves, controlled by slaves. What do I mean by that? South Asian workers for years have been the backbone of that country, and they have built Dubai and Abu Dhabi as these shining, glittering mega cities, but actually in reality, they are the only way they can survive is to have a huge army of literal slave labor. People don't know what I'm talking about. Google it. I'm not making that up by any means.
Yeah,
And
I mean, everything you're saying, I've seen firsthand. I've been to the UAE, I've been to the Gulf, I've been to all of those countries, and
Mm,
they are not. I mean, one of the frustrations for me of Israel is that it's prevented the normal development. I think it's prevented the normal development of the Arab world. The
mm,
the the way in which despotic Arab leaders have been able to play their publics against Israel as this perennial bugaboo has prevented the normal social development of those societies. And of course, it's changed now with these open and friendly relations between Saudi and Israel and the UAE and Israel.
yes,
Uh,
yes,
but it does have an effect, I think, of warping those societies. Uh,
agreed.
but back to kind of the Israel lobby, why Israel specifically? So lots of countries, including the Gulf Arab monarchies, control captive people, have a relationship with markets and the West. Why has Israel been so adept at developing its um, occupation for the purposes of a domestic arms industry? In other words, are there other countries who are able to do this, or is there something specific about Israel which enables this to happen?
The global arms industry, as people will know, is not just Israel. The biggest weapons dealer in the world is the US. They control about 45% of the weapons in the world. There's obviously Russia, China, France, Germany. These countries are selling weapons to horrible regimes as well. Clearly, it's not just Israel. However, and it's an important however, Israel has had for over half a century a ready-made occupied people, the Palestinians, to literally day in, day out test weapons, surveillance tech, walls, whatever the technology may be. So that has given Israel and how they promote it as vast inverted commas experience in managing, again, inverted commas, unwanted populations. And many, many countries look to that with deep admiration. And that has not changed, by the way, Ahmed, since October 7, including countries that publicly have opposed what Israel is doing. Privately, as I hear many times through various sources, deeply admire what Israel has done for two reasons in Gaza. One, they've gotten away with it, which is something that I talk about in the book a lot. Israel often sells the idea of getting away with it. That's not something you sell for money, but it's a concept. It's the idea that says, and many countries have gone to Israel over the years, long before October 7, and said, you essentially are occupying a people indefinitely. There's no sanctions, there's no punishment. In fact, the opposite, you get huge amounts of Western support for doing so. Teach us how to do that in our own countries. We want to go after our own minorities or indigenous populations, either help us strategically, train us, or sell us the weapons and surveillance tech to do it. And I show there's been huge amounts of countries doing that. In the Arab world, I very much think that the reason so many Arab states are buying Israeli surveillance tech, particularly, is that they utterly fear their own people. They're petrified of them, really. And they're petrified of a so-called Arab Spring 2.0. Now, the Arab Spring, in many ways, one can look at now as, I don't want to use the word disaster, but clearly most of those states are maybe even more oppressive than they were before. Using Israeli surveillance tech, there is a belief, rightly or wrongly, that those Arab states can prevent any kind of public uprising. And I think also there has been, and I don't need to tell you this, but you know, there's profound contempt amongst many Arab elites towards Palestinians, which has been the case for decades.
Yeah,
Decades.
yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right about all of those elements. And then as you're speaking, I'm thinking about why Israel and what's so special about Israel. And you mentioned surveillance. Israel has had in a lab, you want as many controlled conditions as you can have. And Israel controls the population registries, who comes in, who
Indeed.
comes out. It's kind of ideal surveillance
Yes.
conditions.
And they sell that. I mean, that's what they're selling in a way. They're selling the weapons and the surveillance tech. And some countries only want to buy the technology, but some countries, this is a point I wanted to make, which is increasingly relevant. Israel is also selling an idea, which is very alluring, an idea of in Israel's case, a Jewish supremacist ethno-nationalist state that is proudly anti-diversity, anti-gay rights, despite what Israel claims, anti-Islam, anti-immigration. That is a very alluring idea for much of the global far right. And it's not accidental, even in the last month, that the Israeli government itself is inviting Tommy Robinson, who's a far right thug from the UK, anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, on an official trip to show, I presume, the British people why Israel should be the model to follow. Traditionally, the far right is anti-Semitic,
Hmm.
neo-Nazi at times, and it makes sense when you see the far right in Germany and Sweden and France and the US. I know there's a growing split in MAGA around Israel, which is complicating things a bit. I mean, I would argue that so-called split with Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, who traditionally, or particularly Fuentes, is a proud anti-Semite. I mean, no question about it. The idea that if anyone, just as a brief aside, thinks that Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Fuentes is your friend or ally, get your head read. They are not your friends at all. I think they are deeply toxic, horrible human beings. Now, yes, they are critical of Israel now, and we can listen to what they say, and clearly they're inspiring many on the right and the far right to be more critical. But they're not friends of any kind of unified Palestine, certainly, or any kind of democratic future for the Middle East. In fact, the opposite of that. But that's just a
Right.
brief aside. But
So they're
Israel is a
motivated by
model.
nativism. I
Native,
agree.
exactly. And
And
I'm
for
sure,
those
like
of
you,
you,
Ahmed, I mean, go on, you go
I think it's the latency between us. You're on the other side of the planet, or am I
on.
on the other side of the planet? But you're right, they're nobody's friend. But what Stephanie Fox of JVP said to me is that we, as people on the left, need to be mindful that when coalitions rupture or when there's this kind of tumult, there may be opportunities to peel people off and engage and encourage people to think
I'd
different.
agree with that. I agree with Stephanie on that. For sure, I would not disagree.
Yeah,
But it's not accidental that when you see far right movements in all the countries I mentioned, much of Europe, the US, certainly Australia, they increasingly view Israel as the country they want to mimic. They
right.
want to have Christian ethno-nationalist states that profoundly discriminate against, in their case, Muslims, immigration, etc.
You know, it's
And
not our topic, but just watching how Vivek Ramaswamy has been treated by this emergent Christian nationalist, right? And even J.D. Vance talking about his Hindu wife. It makes me sad for those people, although obviously their politics are extremely bad. So speaking of bad
I
politics,
wouldn't feel too sorry for if yeah, so do you feel sorry in JD Vance's case for his wife, who's obviously
right?
being, I mean,
Yeah,
look, I don't know her, but I think you married him, mate. I mean,
yeah,
you didn't know what he was like. I mean, look, I don't want to get into, I don't know their personal, I don't know, but
sure.
I
That's
haven't got a
that's
lot of
how
sympathy for her. But
that's
yeah.
how my wife feels about it. You
Okay,
should.
fair enough. Yeah, I don't have much sympathy for her. I think you married a
Yeah.
guy like that, you made your bed. Anyway,
And that's also a reasonable position to take. But speaking of again bad politics and bad ideas, you and I co-edited this book 12 years ago, I think, after Zionism recently reissued.
post
And
October 7. Yeah.
the idea that Jewish Israelis would discard Zionism, move past Zionism, in the way that Australia moved past, genocidal policies, in the way that the United States has mostly moved past genocidal policies vis-a-vis, Native Americans and Black people, and that we would have something like the U.S. today, a very conflicted, challenging place in many ways, but ultimately it works, at least before 2016, for people who live here. Um, where do you stand today? I mean, is one state still the goal, the possibility?
It's a yes, but we're certainly far away from it. I mean, as people on this podcast will know, I mean, there's one state now, it's just an apartheid state. So clearly there is a one state of sorts. The idea that Israeli Jews, or at least enough of them, will kind of wake up and realize the either awfulness of the occupation or awfulness of Zionism, that I'm far from convinced of. I don't know if I was convinced of it 12 years ago. I don't think I was, but I do not think there is there's very little chance that enough of them. There are some who do, and I'm sure you know some Israeli Jews, as do I, who are amazing and brave and fantastic, but they're a tiny minority. And in fact, the last 2 years has shown, as public opinion polls in Israel have revealed, as I call it, a genocidal mania within Israeli Jews. I think so much of the West and Western press obsesses over Netanyahu, which to me misses the point entirely. He's a prime minister. Of course, you can't ignore him. He's a
I think that is the
unf
point with
Yeah,
respect.
I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, he's obviously a historical figure. I mean, for terrible reasons. But what I'm saying is that the problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. It's just not. And the views of the majority of Israeli Jews, based on polling, they supported the mass starvation of Palestinians. They support ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. You are not going to get enough of Israeli Jews to realize the awfulness and the immorality and the illegality of that. You will not. I think the only way this will change is outside pressure. Is, for example, as we saw in the last few months, for the first time, Ahmed in living memory, a number of nations starting to not buy Israeli weapons. The Israeli arms industry itself was a bit concerned about this because as an industry which is so necessary for that country's future, I would argue. Spain, for example, cut $1 billion of weapons sales. It's not going to bring down the Israeli state. A de-Zionizing process is so necessary, but I think it's as necessary in the West as it is in Israel. And as someone who is Jewish, I very much have talked a lot about recently, and I've said it for a long time, but it's even more relevant in the last 2 years. There is a moral reckoning required within the Jewish community around what many Jews have supported, what they continue to support, the profound failure of organized Jewish organizations, the profound failure and racism of the vast majority of rabbis who speak week in, week out about let's give thanks and praise to the IDF, which, after the recent Jewish high holidays in the last few months, a lot of people send me sermons of rabbis in the US and Australia and elsewhere. I don't want to generalize, of course, but in general, these sermons are horrific and delusional. Let's pray for our IDF soldiers in Gaza. Now, without a moral reckoning outside of Israel as well, because frankly, Israel doesn't survive without outside support. They just don't, mostly from the US, but elsewhere. So to me, the ultimate goal needs to still be some kind of unified state where everybody is treated equally. But, oh, I don't think we're close to it. And I think the process to get there is going to be really bloody.
Yeah, I think you're
What do
right.
you think?
I agree with you. I think you've said some really important things about de-radicalizing Israelis, but also de-radicalizing Zionists everywhere.
Yeah, yeah,
The people who can watch a rape video and say nothing about it, or actively bury or elide the word rape, as what the New
yeah,
York Times were reporting, that indicates a deep sickness
yeah.
that needs to be addressed, I would argue. But there's another dimension to the challenge for me, which is that the Palestinians in Gaza and across everywhere have been so deeply traumatized by the genocide. How do you ask somebody whose family's been wiped out, who's missed years of education, who's regressed in terms of standard of living to, I don't know, the fifth century,
Mm,
to somehow accommodate themselves to the guy
yeah,
who did it, who now lives, 20 miles or 30 kilometers away.
yeah,
So that dimension of the idea of kind of sharing in Palestine, Israel,
mm,
I don't know how to overcome that. And I don't feel I
yeah,
or anybody can ask people in Palestine to live
mm,
alongside Jewish Israelis after what they've done. And I feel
yeah,
comfortable saying what they've done because of what you cited, which is the wall-to-wall
indeed.
support. There's been maybe a
Yes.
hundred refuseniks. I'm probably overstating that
It's
substantially.
small. It's small. I mean, and good on them for doing that, but it's very small. And I mean, I looked at South Africa today, and I was there last year when I was filming my series on the Palestine Laboratory. And of course, the end of apartheid in 1994 is an undeniably good thing. But here we are, decades on. The apartheid hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. It's economic apartheid. It's a deeply corrupt ANC government, and the communities are still mostly separated. I'm not saying whites and blacks don't live near each other, including based on what you were just saying, that are there huge amounts of black South Africans living down the road from white South Africans who abused them and tortured them? Some, but many still not. Now, that doesn't mean that apartheid shouldn't have ended. Clearly, it should have. But it goes to the real challenges. And I think South Africa actually has done a really bad job, actually, at managing its post in 1994 reality. And that's a lot to do with the corruption of the ANC. I think Mandela has a lot to answer for on this question. I really do. Not a popular view, perhaps. I think he was an amazing man in many ways, but there are real questions about his so-called vision for what South Africa would look like after 1994. And look, as you say, Ahmed, I feel the same way. Who am I to say that a Palestinian in Gaza, or for that matter, the West Bank, should feel comfortable living down the road from someone who killed their family or tortured them? It's not, absolutely, it's not for me to say that at all. Would that be different in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I don't know. I mean,
Right.
I think that feeling, I mean, in terms of would Palestinians there have that view? I mean, I think also it's worth saying, and you and I have discussed this before elsewhere, that the mainstream political options that Palestinians have is pretty bad. The options are basically, there are alternatives, Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. There are other options, I'm well aware of that, but they're the main options. That if and when there's an election in Palestine, which still feels like a very far away, are they the main options that people are going to be given? Again, it's not for me to, it's not, this is for Palestinians to do. It's not for me to do, but that to me is I'm worried about that because I think they've both done a bloody horrible job in managing the situation there, frankly.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I do want to emphasize that the last time the elections happened in 2005, Hamas won and was swiftly
Indeed.
locked out of any kind of governance. And so
Indeed.
those elections,
Indeed.
2006 were the legislative elections.
Yeah.
I always go back to David Rose's reporting in Vanity Fair, the
I
gospel.
remember that story.
And so it's just a question of what could have been. And the reality for me is that the Palestinians aren't permitted to have normal right-wing parties like Hamas, which is what that would map onto,
Yeah.
or labor socialists or whatever it may be. The,
I'm not dismissing any of that. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, Palestinians have been making bad choices for themselves. You're absolutely right. Of course, that's true. Absolutely agree with you on that. Of course. Um, they haven't been allowed to build any alternative political options. And
yeah.
clearly, much of the so-called Western vision remains tying themselves to the PA.
So let me ask you a final question now. Where do you see all of this? You've been involved now in Palestine, Israel as a professional journalist for 22 years. Where do you see things going in the next 20 years? And I'm also talking about questions like migration. You talked about how there are no Jews left in Germany. So what does Palestine, Israel look like in 20 years?
In the last year, huge amounts of Israeli Jews are leaving Israel for a range of reasons. I think it is not unlikely that Israel will become, and it's already moving in this direction, a increasingly theocratic country. That religious fundamentalist Zionists will be, who are not the majority now of population, but increasingly will be because their birth rates are incredibly high. Even so-called liberal Israelis, many of whom would support and did support the genocide, I don't think want to live under a theocracy. There's a good chance they would leave if they have a second passport. And we'll get to the Palestinians in a minute. So the vision, and it's obviously not a vision that any sane person would support. I mean, the vision of these people who believe it should be a theocracy is Afghanistan or Iran. That's their vision. That's what they want. Would the Western states that back Israel support that? You tell me. I don't know. How strong is their racism and Holocaust guilt? I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Mhm.
Um, if the US increasingly becomes a Christian nationalist fundamentalist state, they may well support it. If it moves back to a kind of quasi weak, Pete Buttigieg presidency, God forbid, or somebody like that, I'm not sure. I mean, I honestly don't know. And not because I think he's any good, but I mean, I don't know if someone like him or a person like him would support a Jewish theocracy. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, I think Israel is increasingly becoming that way. I don't think there are many forces against it. In terms of Palestine, I, people often said to me in the last 2 years, Palestinians can't wait for some kind of resolution. Decisions are being made for them and on the ground. I mean, annexation in the West Bank is happening. It's happened for years.
It's de
I,
facto there,
it's
right?
de facto exactly there. It's a reality. I do not see many pressures against Israel to continue that plan. I still think the ultimate goal of many, if not most, Israeli Jews is removing as many Palestinians as possible from both the West Bank and Gaza, let alone Israel itself. How that will happen in practical reality, I don't know, but I think it's not unlikely that there still would be a political goal, regardless of who is in charge of Israel, to force many Palestinians out, either making life so intolerable that they are forced out to, I don't know where, Jordan, Egypt, God knows where. And I am very pessimistic at the moment. I, and what worries me is that internationally, the pressure that was slowly sort of being imposed on Israel, that was mostly in words, not actions, is already kind of receding. A vote within the EU to maybe sanction Israel's put on hold. A vote to potentially kick Israel out of Eurovision stopped. A vote to potentially kick Israel out of FIFA, the International World Cup, which is happening next year in the US, stopped. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. And then finally, the challenge that we all have is the mass public outcry and outrage and public protest, which is undeniably real, that's been happening for the last 2 years. How do you get that how do you get that power and movement into political action? I don't have an answer for that. I have thoughts about it, but I don't have an answer. I think that is the challenge that we face.
Right. I agree with you, and I share your pessimism. I regret that that's true, but I do, and I think that the trajectory, that the version of the state where Palestinians have been mostly driven out, that's the trajectory that we're on. And I don't see how anybody arrests that today. I want to thank Antony Loewenstein, filmmaker, journalist, for joining me today. Everybody should
Thanks,
go to the
Ahmed.
Palestine Laboratory. I mean, it's a lot of heavy lifting, I think, that made a really, really important contribution. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Ahmed, for all your amazing work. And just for viewers who aren't aware, I think you and I first started connecting in about 2011
Yeah.
when we were much younger and didn't have children. So, yeah,
Definitely.
thank you.
Bye, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you.